We're back with Pitch Sport. Don, it's me. I'm like Grash. You just can't get rid of me, man. I'm just you're a fountain of knowledge. So therefore, I won't leave you alone. That's many questions. Nice to see you again.
Thank you. You too. At least I'm a drip of knowledge, anyway.
Now, today's subject is fights that never were, obviously, because that's all this public frustration of what's happening with certain fights. Spence, Crawford, Fury, AJ. Let's go back in history. Let's see if it's the same story, different acts. See if this has happened before. Let's start off with, obviously, John L. Sullivan, Jack Johnson.
Yeah. Well, look, we go back. There's a tradition in boxing, obviously, it goes back forever. Today, we said there's a big corporate entities that are stopping a lot of these fights because of they're not willing to allow their commodity to go fight for another television company. Back then, the big excuse was, well, the biggest fight early, turn of the 20th century, was John L. Sullivan and a fighter named Peter Jackson, who was a black fighter originally from the Virgin Islands, but went to Australia to establish himself, came to America, and he was really revered. He and Sullivan, when the Boxing Hall of Fame started in 1989, they were charter members. They were elected together. But they used always race as an excuse. It was a fight anticipated by everybody in those days. And it just didn't happen because, again, Sullivan said he would have fought him. He didn't get enough offers, didn't get enough money. But had he agreed to do it, he would have. And then they said he drew the color line. But it was convenient. I think if Jackson had been day. And also you have to look back in those times, most jurisdictions didn't even have boxing legalized. So to find the money to fund a super fight like that was difficult.
Of course, but Sullivan then eventually, that line was blurred when he ended up fighting Jack Johnson.
Well, Sullivan didn't fight Jack Johnson. It was Jim Jeffries who fought Jack
Jeffries,
Johnson. Yeah. So Jeffries did, and the first time, this first iteration as champ, Jeffries, Johnson was poised to fight. There was a lot of pressure on him to fight. And for Jeffries, Johnson was upset by a fighter named Marvin Hart. So Marvin Hart beats him, and that sort of eliminated Johnson for the time being. And at that point, Jeffries retired. But a lot of stuff to me, Johnson is confused. There was a lot of racial element. But if you read the newspapers of the day, when he was not champion, many of the reporters got behind him and were pushing Johnson should get the shot irrespective of his race. And at that time, we had a lot of black fighters who were champs. Joe Walcott, Joe Gans, George Dixon, proportionate to the population, of course. So they weren't denying that. I think it was Johnson then get the title, and his personality, I think, was gritting on people more than anything else. That's where they sort of getting out here. And he taunted his opponents, all of whom happened to be white. And the reason for that was that 99% of the fighters in that era were white. So they called Jeffries back, and after 6-year layoff, he came back and was bombarded. The reaction was so bad because Johnson was sort of like, not in terms of politics, because he really was apolitical, but in personality of his Ali of his day. And Ali taunted black fighters, we know, like Frazier and Terrell. Well, he had Jeffries, and was this made up as this great icon. Probably never should have taken the fight. And it did hurt black fighters fighting for the heavyweight title for a generation, until Joe Louis came by. And then the next big fight that didn't take place after Johnson and Sullivan Jackson was Dempsey and Harry Wills. And Wills was a victim of the reaction to Johnson,
Yeah, exactly. I suppose Johnson learned from probably what Peter Jackson didn't do. So he's thinking, I'll do the opposite. I'll goad, I'll embarrass, I'll put pressure on with my mouth, to the point where, he probably was a few years ahead of his time to understand. You've got sometimes someone's going to play the pantomime villain. So if he's going to play it, he's going to play it good. So that's why he got himself into that position. You mentioned Jack Dempsey, Harry Wills again, the same story, different actors.
And I'll tell you, Dempsey was the greatest attraction of his times. And Wills, people forget this. He was one, if he had come a generation before, Wills would have been fighting for small purses like Sam Langford did, and Jeanette, and great fighters, but they had to fight each other. They would fight all the best white fighters who were willing to fight them. And they would get relatively good money for their time, maybe $10,000 for a fight, 20 in some cases. Wills are making 50, 60, 70, 80,000, 100,000. He fought Firpo in Jersey City, and they drew 70,000 people. So it showed that sports fans, boxing fans, they don't care about the race. There are people who are, I think, the fringe fans, but the hardcore fan, John, we just want to see a good fight. We don't care. come from the moon and fight a guy from Mars. It's a fight. We'll see it. And Wills was supported. The New York Commission got behind to the point where they said they would suspend Dempsey unless he boxed against Harry Wills. So there was a promoter, Floyd Fitzsimmons from the Midwest, who had promoted the Dempsey-Misk fight earlier and signed them to box. He was giving a guarantee of $100,000 to Wills and $300,000 or a million, I think, to Dempsey against a percentage of the gate. So they both would have made maybe more than that. And Wills signed, got a $50,000 advance. Dempsey was to have gotten a $200,000 advance, but they gave him $25,000 just to buy the fight. And when Dempsey went to cash the $25,000 check, it bounced. And that promoter, Fitzsimmons, said, I'll have the money to you in 3 days, and nothing showed up. So it was an excuse to cancel the fight. Whether he ever had the money or didn't have the money, that's questionable. But when they did try to do it, Tex Rickett had been the promoter of the Jeffries and Johnson. He was a guy from Texas, which was a Confederate state, which was, virtually an apartheid kind of a state with Jim Crow laws and a segregationist state. I wouldn't say he's racist, but he promoted Johnson Jeffries. And the reaction to that did set boxing back. They banned the interstate sale of distribution of fight films. It hurt black fighters more than anyone else, that the reaction to it. And so he was stung. He never wanted that to happen again. Now, Wills had a 180% degree different kind of personality than Johnson. He was not this kind of outspoken, audacious kind of a guy like Jack Johnson was, but still, Rickett was reluctant to put the fight on. He promoted other black fighters in matches, but he had a problem. The reaction to the Jeffries Johnson that had taken place only 13 years before was so profound in him. And they said it was sort of like a passive agreement. Well, we're going to say the fight should take place, but nobody's putting it. But when the real legitimate time was to do it, the promoter who was supposed to come up with that money just didn't produce it. And that was the excuse. And then Dempsey obviously went on to fight Tunney. They drew 120,000 people. Wills went on to fight. He eventually lost to Jack Sharkey, which sort of ended his career as a contender.
There are so many, when you talk about checks being bounced, I thought that was a new thing. That's gone on forever.
Oh, no, this is boxing. We keep the tradition. They go on for 110 years, forever. Yes, they've been bouncing for a long time. I'm still a bouncing.
Mickey Walker, Benny Leonard, again, same story, different actors.
This was a great fight. Benny Leonard was the greatest lightweight of his generation. Walker was the greatest welterweight of his time. One was Irish, one was Jewish. They were going to fight in New York. Leonard was toward the tail end of his lightweight career. He had beaten Lou Tendler. They drew 70,000 people. While Walker had lost to Harry Greb in a bid for the middleweight title, he'd come back and successfully defended his welterweight title. So it was a hot fight about 1924. They signed to fight. Leonard took a tune-up fight with a fighter named Pal Moran and hurt his hand. Now, in those days, without TV, the radio wasn't that big a distribution. You needed a big live gate. They needed to draw 60, 70,000 to pay these guys the kind of money they wanted. I think Leonard was guaranteed $500,000 and Walker 250,000 something. So it was incredible money. So you had to draw $1 million basically to break even. And it went through, and Leonard wasn't fit for the fight with his hand. They postponed it to a following year. Then Leonard got hurt again, and then it just sort of filtered away, and the fight never took place. Walker ended up losing a fight to a big upset, a boxer out of Scranton, Pennsylvania, Pete Latzo, one of the biggest upsets of all time. Leonard retired, then makes a comeback at the after he lost money in the Wall Street crash of 1929, and eventually lost to Jimmy McLaren, a rising welterweight. But McLaren and Walker were just generations, two ships passing in the night, and they never boxed. Walker was up to the light heavyweight division by then. So it was a great fight. There were tickets actually printed, John. You can have, that's a great collector's item, the Walker-Leonard ticket in Yankee Stadium. I
bet they're very rare too.
Very rare. And the fight probably would have drawn 70,000 people without question, or 80,000. So it was one of the most anticipated what-if fights of all. People still talk about it. Who would have won that fight, which is interesting. But we'll never know, but that was a fight on the cusp.
I wonder what the public response was. So right now we hear the public response with social media, TV, everybody can connect all over the world. But then around that time, that was like, there must have been such a backlash in the fight not happening for that reason.
Well, if you read the newspaper, contemporary paper, they were, I mean, this was the great fight, the two Superman fight, like Leonard and Hearns, Duran and Leonard, I guess, would be closer to the analogy, and the two best of their time. So it was really anticipated. And all right, they accepted the first one. Then the second one, you started to wait a year, it's postponed another year, sort of like Pacquiao Mayweather. It kept being made, not made. And finally they did it. They finally did it and drew a tremendous crowd, despite the fact they were both past their prime, Pacquiao perhaps more so. But yeah, it was a big letdown. It was a really anticipation. And then for Walker then to lose to a 20-1 underdog, that really sort of, took out all the steam from any possibility of the match taking place.
So it's not just happening today. Jimmy Braddock, Max Schmeling again, all over again.
This is an example where the black fight actually was the beneficiary. What had happened is there were two big upsets set the fight up. Jimmy Braddock was a good light heavyweight contender who, after he lost to Tommy Loughran, moved to heavyweight, but he was in and out. He was losing fights more so than he won. Many say he became an alcoholic. The depression hit. He was in the hard times. And, they called him in as an opponent for a fight. And he upset the apple cart, beating a fighter named he beat Art Lasky and then John Henry Lewis, and then beat this Corn Griffin on the semifinal to Max Baer and Primo Carnera for the heavyweight title. And they gave him the title fight. He fought his way up there, hard knocks, and came through. He was, again, really looked at. If you thought Chisora was given no chance, this was like nothing. It was just on Baer's personality, who was a similar kind of a guy to Tyson Fury, maybe not as aggressive, but all overwhelming person, great puncher, good-looking guy, big guy, personable. And Braddock upset him, Cinderella man. That's where that phrase came from. Mm-hmm. Just a shock and did it. And he sort of was a metaphor for all the people struggling during the Depression. See, if you stick in there, you can come through too. And now Joe Louis is sort of like the de facto heavyweight champ. He comes to New York undefeated, but we've seen other good black fighters here. We've seen Langford, we've seen Wills. What's this? And he destroys Primo Carnera in front of 55,000 people. Then he goes on to fight Baer, right after Baer lost to Braddock in a pretty close fight, knocks him out. And this guy then became the de facto heavyweight champ of the world. This was we don't care about Braddock. We don't care about Baer. This is the heavyweight champ of the world. Well, on this, Lewis goes and fights Max Schmeling, another former heavyweight champ. Again, probably a 20-1 underdog, maybe 100-1 if he has the public sympathy. And Schmeling amazingly knocks him out. Mm-hmm. So Schmeling at the time, so now you're setting up Schmeling, who's caused a huge upset, against Braddock, who caused a huge upset to win the title. Madison Square Garden had Schmeling under contract at the time. And Braddock, because Braddock had won the title for them. So they set up but a new party comes into this named Mike Jacobs. And Mike Jacobs was sort of like Don King and Bob Arum a generation later. He was the new trend bucking the establishment, the Madison Square Garden. And he made a deal with Braddock that was such an amazing deal. He was guaranteed close to $300,000 to fight Joe Louis for the title if he didn't take the Schmeling match, and 10% of the profits from the shows. I'll tell you what they thought of Joe Louis, John. The deal he made with Braddock was you get 10% of the profits for Joe Louis's title defenses for the next 10 years.
Wow.
Who would anticipate a fighter who just got knocked out that when he won the title, he'd be champ for 10 years? Yeah. That's how great Joe Louis' reputation was before he was champ. So they did this and that, and somehow he pulled out of the fight. And there's a famous photo of Schmeling at the weigh-in and no-show Braddock. So Braddock went out. There were all sorts of lawsuits. They had to take the fight from New York and put it in Chicago. And then Joe Louis came back, won the title. So there, a black fighter actually was the beneficiary of manipulation, not giving the German guy who the opportunity. So they favored Joe Louis was a black fighter, but he was an American fighter.
American, so that was what made the difference.
German fighter, yeah. So he got the benefit of it. Eventually forced Schmeling, knocked him out in one round, the rematch, set everything straight, and went on for a decade more as world heavyweight champ.
In today's fight game, it's not very often fighters are in a position to be so powerful to say in the rematch, I want a percentage of X amount of fights after. I think the last fight I knew that did that was something like, I was here behind against Klitschko. He did a deal like that when he lost to Vitali. I think it was for 2 or 3 fights after that. So still, even though he lost, he ended up very wealthy from that. Let's move on. We moved to the 70s upwards. George Foreman, Larry Holmes. past and it was sort of present at the time.
You know, it's interesting. They had two incarnations. They had the early Holmes and the early Foreman, and they both came back in the 90s and were really quite successful. If you follow that career, I mean, Foreman obviously won the title, and Larry got shots at the championship with he lost to Tyson, but then made a comeback and fought 20 more times, and he lost a fairly close fight to Oliver McCall, beat Ray Mercer. So the first time around, Foreman turned pro, and I remember I was at that fight on the Quarry Frazier card, 1968. He beat a guy, Don Waldheim. Now, Foreman had come from the Olympics in 68, made himself famous by waving the American flag. A lot of tests. Not just opportunistic that somebody gave him a flag, but he came back as a hero of one portion of America. You know, we were in the Vietnam War as well, so he back a hero. Those are 5,000 his pro debut. That was 54 years ago. It was not bad. And pulls back, of course, the knockout over Frazier, knocks out Norton. It was on a trend. Larry came up hard knock. He came out of Easton, Pennsylvania. He did not get into the Olympics.
He was just a sparring partner for Ali. He was a simple sparring partner.
For Ali, yes. So he had that sort of record, but he sort of peaked. Foreman had retired at that point when Larry came up, but there was talk of the match. It just was the kind of fight in that first go round where I don't think Holmes was big enough. Risk reward. The risk to fight Holmes wasn't big enough for Foreman to do it, and there were other bigger fish in the pan to fry. Now it was talked of in the rematch and the reincarnation, I should say, when they were older. Of all people, Roger Levitt, who was one of these promoters involved with Lennox Lewis, yes, he signed them to fight. He actually signed the fight in the Houston Astrodome, and it was very similar to Dempsey-Wills. He gave an advance to Foreman and an advance to Holmes, and then he was supposed to come up with the big money. I think they got 25,000 a piece or 50. And then, of course, they're going to get $250,000 against this huge guarantee he had that the guys of $2.5 or $3 million apiece. And well, the second deposit, the $300,000 deposit, fell short. Holmes, to his credit, was willing to take less to bet on the fight taking place. But Foreman said, if you don't give me the money I want, there's no fight. And it never happened. But I think there were posters. I know he had a memorable press conference at the New York Palace Hotel with Smirnoff Vodka was one of his primary sponsors. But the press conference, John, was held 2 years before the fight. And why was that? So he could find investors between the press conference and the fight to put the match on.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's another great what if, of the time. They're about the same age, could have fought. As I said, I think Foreman was at a different juncture in his career the first time around. And the second time, it just came to a matter of money, where Foreman's, I think, plateau as an attraction was greater than Larry's, and he could dictate.
Foreman again, Jerry Quarry. These fights, we look and think, wow, can you imagine that kind of punch power in the ring together?
Well, that was a fight. Quarry had come back. He had lost to Joe Frazier. He had lost to George Chavallo, and they brought him back, and he came to the Garden and fought Randy Newman and beat him, and that set up a fight with Ron Lyle. And Lyle at the time was this phenomenon, undefeated and everything else. And Quarry beats him on a 12-round decision. Now his comeback starts, and he starts gaining the momentum. In the meantime, Foreman knocks out Joe Frazier in 1973 to win the heavyweight championship of the world. Shocks everybody.
Bounced him off the floor. He bounced him off the floor, Joe Frazier. He did.
It was like a basketball.
Yeah.
And then he goes on, and so the momentum then, so Quarry knocks out Ernie Shavers in one round. Now the momentum for Shavers, for Quarry, Foreman is colossal. And, there was a Ring magazine with notable cover with Foreman, Quarry, Madison Square Garden. It was just like they were ready to sign the papers. And then again, like Mike Jacobs showed up and induced Braddock not to fight against Schmeling, but to take the deal with Lewis. Don King comes out of the woodwork, and he comes up to produce a fight with George Foreman in Zaire against Ali for $5 million. So it comes down to, again, risk reward. What do you end up doing here? You go to get $5 million in a crazy thing. Nobody thought that was going to come up. Zaire never heard of the country, and yet they did it. Oh, what did I do here? Hold on. I took myself off the screen. 1 second. Oh, sorry, no technical knowledge. Anyway, so he comes up out of nowhere and pulls a Mike Jacobs on Madison Square Garden. They're always the victim here, and he signs George Foreman, and he takes him out instead of fighting Frazier. He makes him against instead of fighting Quarry, he makes him against Ali and Zaire, and the rest is history. Quarry goes on to fight Joe Frazier in a rematch. That was the consolation prize, and he got himself stopped. And Frazier, as a result of that, ends up with a third Ali fight, which becomes the Thriller in Manila. So everybody sort of got something out of it, but Quarry never got his fight against Foreman.
Of course, and then we go further on. We come further up into the 1980s. Tyson against Foreman. But Foreman's obviously he's older. He's at the back end of it against this young buck.
Yeah,
a fight that would have been intriguing, but was the right decision not to happen.
You know, I think there's a lot of people say, "Oh, Foreman's had the style to beat Tyson. He didn't want it." That was another situation again. Foreman was a kind of a guy, at that point, he had reached a level where he was, again, a personality. He won the title, if you remember, knocking out Moore after losing most of the rounds. And then after that, he didn't really fight any competitive bouts. He didn't fight the Bows. He didn't fight Lennox Lewis, obviously. He didn't fight Holmes. He didn't fight Tyson. I don't think he needed it. I think there was talk about it. And I think on Tyson's side, the thing was, what do I have to gain fighting him? If I look bad, they're going to say, this old man beat him up, or this old man looking bad. And if I knock him out, they're going to say, boy, knocked out a 45-year-old guy. Who cares? I mean, Foreman did, as you recall, fight Evander Holyfield. And Holyfield, beat him pretty well, but he went the limit, and he had enough left that he kept fighting and eventually knocked out Moore. So I think that fight could have been done. I probably came down to money. That's generally what the situation is. And it probably came down to Foreman setting a price, maybe too high, and Tyson some slight reluctance. I don't think fear of fighting Foreman, but I think fear of, if he makes me look bad,
Looking back, yeah,
hurt my reputation. And if I knock him out, it's going to hurt my reputation.
Styles make fights. Styles make fights. And
Yes.
Of course, Evander Holyfield boxed Foreman, and it was, listen, it was, you saw two guys standing there trying to tear it out. I'm quite sure Tyson, if that had happened against Foreman, you got two powerful guys. Nobody's going to dance around the ring. So the chances of that probably going the distance was slim. But again, Foreman always had that power to hit and maybe take somebody out. Would they risk this young up-and-coming star to and put him in such a fight, risk reward again? It just in the way out.
Yes, and also looking at Foreman when he was 45 on the cover, we have to remember that this wasn't the Foreman that knocked out Frazier and Chavallo and Ken Norton. This was a slower, more ponderous guy. We forget that in addition, to losing to Holyfield, he also lost to Tommy Morrison right before the other fight. So yeah, I think again it was a kind of a fight that great anticipation with the public, and again Tyson, unless it was a huge payday, everything to lose. Yes, he would have made money, but again, looking bad, even not losing would hurt him. Losing would, that would really crash this myth of the invincible guy. And winning and beating Foreman up or knocking him out, Foreman was the hero. He was the guy. It's like when Ali lost to Larry Holmes. Nobody gave credit to Holmes. They all said, poor Ali. He was a victim. And I think maybe Tyson didn't want to go through that situation. Yeah,
I can imagine. Again, it's about timing is everything. Archie Moore, Sugar Ray Robinson. Two very, very good skillsters. One outstanding skillster at that. Again, a fight that was probably one for the purists. I don't think would have gone the distance, but one for the purists because that's skill on skill.
Oh, no, absolutely. Moore was a great fighter at a heavier weight. There's another one. Even though older than Robinson, I believe he probably would have been too strong at that weight. He could fight heavyweights and, hold his own. He dropped Rocky Marciano, for heaven's sake. This was a fight when the Robinson-Basilio, another great fight, the third fight that didn't take place. Robinson wanted a big fight, so there's talk of he and Moore. And now these are all, legend and apocryphal statements, but there was the talk that Robinson, wanted. Of course, Robinson was always impossible to deal with financially. And Robinson had a group of teleprompter that were going to do the pay-per-view, and they were going to fight in either the Polo Grounds in New York or Yankee Stadium. It was a big, big fight. And, Moore wanted equal money, and Robinson wouldn't agree to that. Then Moore wanted 60-40, and Robinson wouldn't agree to that. And, Moore finally said, look, you're fighting for my title. And Robinson says, listen, more people would rather pay to see me sleep than to see you fight. And that's why I'm getting all of it. So, and that sort of killed it. But again, those kind of fights, it does come down, to money at the time, if the money was. And he was very, very difficult.
There's the fancy fights, the names we could throw together of Joe Frazier, Sonny Liston. Those kind of fights there. What a fight that would have been, these two fighters at their prime.
Well, that was another fight. In 1968, Frazier had won the New York State version of the title after Ali had he relinquished to Ali, said in the press he was there. He kept trying to get his license back, but knowing that wasn't imminent, he gave it up. And then the WBA, well, he hadn't given up yet. The WBA had a tournament. New York had a fight with Frazier and Buster Mathis. They both were fought each other. They weren't going to fight till 1970, as it turned out. And Frazier fought in 1968 in December against Oscar Bonavena, rematch where the guy knocked him down twice and he knocked him out. Card, there was a fight in Baltimore. Liston knocked out Amos Lincoln, an old contender. So the idea was to pair them. This had been the strategy when Patterson fought about a decade early. He had knocked out Tom McNeely in Toronto, and Liston fought Albert Westfall in Philly, and two different pickups, two different cities, same night on closed circuit. Liston won by knockout in one round, Patterson won by knockout, and then they fought subsequent to that. So the intention was to have them fight in April in Houston. But again, now Madison Square Garden steps in. They were working with Frazier. Liston could not get licensed in New York. So obviously Madison Square Garden didn't want to have Joe Frazier fight Sonny Liston, a mega fight that they didn't control out of their matching. Buster Mathis had was matched to fight Chuvalo. And they said to Frazier, wait for the outcome of that fight. And then Mathis won, and they rushed him into a fight with Jerry Quarry. And they were talking the Liston fight. And then Brenner convinced Yank Durham, who was Frazier's manager, look, if Quarry wins, we've got $1 million fight. He said, if you fight Sonny Liston, who knows there will be a Quarry fight. Why don't we wait and see? So instead of fighting Sonny Liston in April, he ended up fighting a guy named Dave Ziglowitz, who went one round if he was lucky. And he ended up, that set up the Quarry fight. Quarry beat Mathis, and they fought in June. So Liston's window of opportunity was short. And when Quarry came back into the picture, it gave them a chance to give Frazier an alternative. Had that not happened, Frazier probably would have fought Liston, although an older Liston, which would have been a great and interesting fight. And Sonny, unfortunately, went on at the end of the year to get knocked out by Leotis Martin, and that just had all possibilities of the fight.
And Sonny still had world aspirations, and so the Frazier one might have been a different outcome. You never know. Let's move more to modern day. Louis Bowe. I can never ever figure out why that didn't happen. I don't get it. And it's down to the individuals. I can remember Bowe throwing his WBO belt in the bin.
Well, that was a lot of I'll tell you what had happened. If you recall the incident, Bowe had won the title. Lennox Lewis had beaten Razor Ruddock, and that was an eliminator. But
good fight.
Yes. And if the champ didn't fight him, they were going to retroactively declare the winner of that the WBC champion. If you recall, they did that with Ken Norton and Jimmy Young. They had fought. The winner was to have fought Leon Spinks, Ali, in fact. And then Ali lost to Spinks, and they ordered the rematch. They fought the rematch because it was a big money fight. WBC said, no, you got to fight Norton instead. This is Leon Spinks. And of course, Spinks opted for the fight with Ali, 10 times the money. And they stripped him, and they said, retroactively, Norton's the champ. So Lewis fought. Bowe beats Holyfield. He's got a rematch clause with Holyfield. But the decision really was made, and I'll say this was off the record, but now the record can be told, that at the time they felt, look, that's not a big enough fight. The risk reward again. If we wait a year, we can make this into a mega fight. Two undefeated Olympians, the Bowe and Lennox Lewis. Let's wait. So he tactlessly handled it. Rock Newman, the manager of Bowe, where they threw the belt in the garbage. They could have said, but the alternative was said, well, we're relinquishing the title, and the obviously the public reaction would, why? Because you're afraid of fighting Lennox Lewis. And the truthful answer would be, well, maybe not afraid, but we don't want to fight him for the kind of money that's available. So the intent was, let's both keep fighting. We'll do this in a year. Well, all of a sudden, Bowe, the fan man, comes along. He loses the title. The fight loses its momentum. Then there was an interest to kick up the fight again, and it was almost made. I went to Mexico with Rock Newman. We got everything solved with Suleiman. Bo genuflected and apologized to Suleiman. They paid a fine with a requisite fine. They were going to sanction Bo and Lewis, and Bo took a tune-up with a guy named Andrew Galata. And the rest is history. He got bounced around. He won the fight in disqualification. Then he said, well, we'll wipe that out. We'll do a rematch. And the same thing happened the second time. So the fight got killed in that instance. So actually, it was, again, it all comes down to risk reward. The first fight, I wasn't complicit with Lewis to have him throw the belt in the ring. But Rock Newman felt this is not the time to make the fight. Let's build it up and we'll have a bigger fight in a year. And unfortunately, it backfired on Bo when he lost to Galata. Or beat Galata, he lost in fact,
Yeah, Bo's career seemed to just spiral in the wrong direction after the Galata fight. Manny Pacquiao, Floyd Mayweather, why did it not happen in their prime?
You know, again, we come back to Al Heyman. Al Heyman is a phenomenon. He's done phenomenal, wonderful things for his fighters. But Al Heyman has the mentality of a manager, not a promoter. You know, a promoter will say, look, we got to make the biggest fights. I'm making my money on the profits. Let the chips fall where they may. I may favor one fight or another, but they got to fight. That's all we care. The best against the best and make a money. Al Heyman's perception is much more subjective, you know, to protect the fighter as a manager thinks. So they were always bringing up steroids and this and that. But again, it goes to a point where you have Mayweather now independent and Pacquiao now at Top Rank, who was the former promoter of Mayweather. So I think it got down to internal politics. But I think Mayweather could have fought anytime he wanted. Why he personally didn't do, why they didn't want it. They wanted optimum circumstances with Manny. Maybe it was an excuse. Maybe they thought he was a little too dangerous at that stage of the career. But it was terrible that take place. It should have. The irony is, John, in today's market, when they finally fought, it was the biggest grossing fight up till now of all time. So again, the personality and the celebrity is so great that even they lose, the hardcore fight fans like us and the people who know the business say, oh, they should have fought 5 years earlier.
But you're still going to watch.
But obviously the public wasn't affected. They still watch. I remember that image of Manny knocked cold by Marquez. And despite that, he was able to do that fight and gross hundreds of millions of dollars against Mayweather. You know, Mayweather went on to end his career with a kickboxer, McGregor, and gross hundreds of millions. So it's a business of which I am unfamiliar. It's not 1896.
Yeah, it was a show hard thing that the tide has turned and the young fighters coming through. They now understand they have to be amazing characters. A fight probably a little close to my heart was Junior Whittaker, Ricky Hatton.
Oh, yes.
It might not have been a big deal over there in the States, but here in the UK, it was that fight. Whittaker become world champion, Hatton to become world champion. They were jumping through hoops trying to get to each other, and then it just fell by the wayside. I suppose Whittaker's star fell quicker than Hatton. So therefore, you know, with business, you know, Hatton filled out arenas, Whittaker filled out phone boxes. So I can understand the business. I can understand that side of it, but it's such a shame the fight didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, again, and that you would think it's a natural. It's two Brits, two champions. Let's get it on. Sometimes they're harder fights to make. Again, the personalities, if they had different promoters, it's difficult to do. Promotional rights have hurt a lot of major fights because of the promoters that would get along, because something that happened to them 20 years before, you know, then the fighters are not going to be able to fight. I'm sure they may have the same promoter at one time. Or sometimes a promoter may sign up a fighter to keep calling it a big fight rate. And they look at the business of the game. And I'm quite sure we could name 3 or 4 fighters that are in that situation now, thinking this is a great commodity coming onto that now. You're talking Fury Joshua. Why has that fight not happened? It's 3 times publicly that fight has almost been made. I thought the last time the fight was talked about, I thought there was ever a chance. It was now. Well, it should have been around this time. Why do you think we're struggling to get that off? And that's like, you know, that should have been the fight in place of Chisora. You know, I mean, Tyson came out and talked. I don't know. Sometimes Tyson Fury talks a good fight, but does he also fight or does he fight the right fight for the public? You know, there's always an excuse, John, not to make a fight if you don't want to. You would never unify champ. Why? Because most of the guys say, I don't want to fight Johnny Nelson. Look, it's not like fighting Sugar Ray Leonard Mike Tyson, I get a multi-million-dollar. He's a tough fight. I'll make more with him than a regular contender, but I just rather fight these guys where I feel I can win. I'll make less money, but it's less of a difficult match, and I'm not making mega bucks. But that was a mega buck fight, Joshua. It must go down to the promoters and the broadcasters. Somebody wasn't willing to give up enough to have the bout take place, but it's very frustrating for the fans. It's very frustrating for the people who have a historical interest in boxing. I would hope, I don't know, John, do you think it's possible that fight can take place in
if I'm honest with you, I don't know. I think trust on both sides have gone. I think both fighters wanted to fight. But I think it's show business. It's a business behind the show that has scuppered this. I agree. Maybe December, when we were talking December 3rd, Joshua Fury. I agree the fight shouldn't have happened if I was in team AJ, because he was vulnerable. That was ego talking. He just come off 2 losses. And then you can see why one did try and keep both fighters apart. But I think the public mistakenly think it's the fighters. But then my argument is this: if you're not a fighter, you're not that main bread and butter fighter, you'll say, "Get me this fight next, no matter what. It's got to happen." And this is why there's a question mark over certain reasons why these fights do and don't happen. Sometimes people prize themselves out of the fight. Sometimes people make ridiculous demands. So a lot of gameplay in there.
A lot of game. The sportsmanship goes out. You bring that up. I'll tell you an anecdote about Carl Froch. We were putting him in our card when Junior Witter actually lost the title to Tim Bradley. He fought the semifinal. And I was making the matches, and we had one guy out of America. I said, well, this guy's 6'1". I don't care. I'll fight him. Guy fell out. Got a southpaw. I said, well, he's a southpaw. I don't care. I'll fight him. Guy fell out. Then we got a guy. Well, this guy a light heavyweight. He's 10 pounds. I don't care. I'll fight him. He turns to me and I said, Don, damn it. Get me anybody. I'll fight anybody you put in the ring. So he finally got a Polish kid. It wasn't much, but he went the limit. But that's the attitude of a great fighter. Just get me anyone. And he fought as champion the same way. He said, I'll fight everybody in the division. Who's there I haven't fought? Give me everyone. I'll lose. I'll win, but I'll fight everyone.
That's the only thing that kills. That's what kills our sport. That fighters are then losing their voice, and the businessmen behind the fighters are saying, no, this is a great business. Because I'm sure, if I have it right, Carl Froch, they were trying to get him to fight Chavez, and I'm sure Barry Hearn said, no, bigger business, better business is against George Groves, and Carl couldn't see. No, I want to fight Chavez. It was iconic. He wanted to box in Vegas. The rest is history, obviously, 80,000 people in Wembley. But that was a business head thinking of how fights. So sometimes fighters, for their own good, of the decisions, forward-thinking businessmen think this will be good for you. But in reality, it's a fight. It's a fighting game. It's a game where you think, I want to get in there and fight anybody. So you love that attitude, especially if you're a fighting man.
Yes, and the irony today is it's not, a lot of these big fights, we say there's the risk reward, but these are the fights that Joshua and Tyson, where the money is there to pay them, the biggest payday, and they're not happening. We talked about Crawford and Spence was another one like that.
Is that
it's a lot about control. Yeah.
Crawford Spence, that's Rick's reward. Is that why we've not seen it yet? Will we ever see that?
Again, Crawford left Top Rank, and when he left Top Rank, he didn't have leverage as a promoter. So all the leverage was with Spence, and Spence's people with Al Heyman. Again, they said, we're going to pay you this. Take it or leave it. He couldn't come back with a counter offer. He said, I got people put up 25 million, but nobody really believed that. That's unfortunate. I mean, logically, he's probably equal to 50-50 on the money. When Frazier and Ellis fought, Frazier was far the greater attraction, but Ellis had the WBA title, and they agreed to split 50-50. It's now it's control, it's this and that. So I don't know we're ever going to see Spence and Crawford. He'll probably move up and wait. And another thing is fighters can make millions without you. It was much more drawn by the live gate and by the attendance at the fights and by what you did on closed circuit years ago when I started a big fight. You want to make the most money, you got to fight the best fighter, the fight that the public wants to see. You can take a lot less. Now guys can get rich fighting mediocre fighters.
Yeah, without you see it.
Millions fighting of Thurman. Nobody really cares about that fight. Yeah. And this guy we're just talking about, Crawford, found some backers. They're going to give him millions to fight an unpronounceable, unknown fighter. So they can say, well, I don't make that fight. I won't make the 10 million or 20 million, but I'll make 2 million. The alternative then, when Frazier boxed against the Ziglowitz, the tune-up fight, he got $50,000.
Wow, my goodness.
Then he got $500,000 for Quarry, but you could take those lesser fights, but you would really get a tremendously lot less money. You couldn't say, well, I'll take a fight for $1 million and 5. No, then you would make next to nothing. So you had to fight fights that people wanted to see.
And the one thing I see, and I always say, there are various world champions that are titled the best fighter in their division. And I probably think there's probably 3, maybe 4 fighters that really believe they are the best fighter in the world. The rest of them just have the trinket of world champion. There are not many fighters out there. Tyson Fury is one of them. He believes he is the best fighter in the world, no matter what. And if their belts are if they're fractured, certain champions, even though they've got the title, do not believe they're the best in the world, and that's where the problem starts to lie. So and with Spence and with Crawford, do these guys really believe? Who believes they really are the best in the world, or is it bluff? Is it a hustle?
Oh, well, it's also the promoters. Look, again, you have television companies investing hundreds of millions now, not just hundreds of millions, to develop a commodity. So they'll take a kid, a flyweight, a lightweight, a heavyweight, from 6 or 7 fights, give him 20 fights, give him big money. You know, fights where you were fighting for 10,000, this guy's getting 100, only because you got a television company that we're going to invest. Now they invest, and they said, well, we didn't invest so he could possibly, unless it's such incredibly big money, so he could lose to a fighter from another network. And we want to make this commodity go on. I know that with the Sauerlands, I work with them. They had Henry Maska and they had Sven Otkin. And they was told, well, fight Roy Jones. And it was said, look, we'll concede Jones is the better fighter, but so what? We're getting $1 million a day for his television shows. We don't have to prove who's the best. We just have to fulfill our TV contract and get this guy to get 10, 15, 20, depends on the title. So it's a deal where, you know, they got TV contracts, they got to fulfill them, they got to have so many world title fights. So if you can get a lesser guy and he's a champ of the WBO or an IBF, whoever it is, and say, look, we're not fighting for the best. We're fighting to fulfill this contract, defend our title. And if you financially, look how it succeeded. You had Maska undefeated with 12 defenses, Otka undefeated, Mitchell Shevsky. They never fought a Roy Jones.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we don't have, that's fine. Bob Foster was something like that. He was the best light heavyweight. They were going to make him with Jimmy Dupree. They offered a very small amount. He turned it down. WBA split the title and had Rondon box Dupree, Vincente Rondon. He beat him. Rondon was getting fights. He was fighting in Italy because the promoter said, I have a chance to beat Rondon. We'll give him more. Force, we have no chance. So he was defending the title for $15,000. When they finally boxed, Foster annihilated him. But I've had promoters tell me, like Mogan's Pally, I know that he's the best fighter. I don't have to put Tom Boggs in there to get him killed to prove it. I can see that, but let me keep getting my guy 46-0, 47-0. I'm quite happy with that. And that's what it is. So if you're in Europe or Japan, you say, hey, this guy's a hero. Maybe the Americans are screaming, fight this guy, but they're saying, that's one big fight, but we can get 10 fights instead. So they're just happy to get that title. That's all they care about.
That's the essence of our game. The essence of our game is usually the best box the best. But then the business comes in and says, you know what, we're going to forget about what they say about you. The new idea now is that it's about money. And that's where I think it dilutes and spoils our game. Because the best on box, the best you see in other sporting combat sports. But I think that's the only thing that probably leaves a sour taste in my mouth.
Yes. Well, you know, as I said, we go back this 120 years, the excuse was, well, he's a black fighter. That wasn't the excuse, John. The excuse was, he's a good black fighter. If I thought I could be, I'll fight him, I could be colored purple. That's not the problem. But Peter Jackson, that guy's as much a risk as, you know, somebody I can get a little less money for. If you weren't so good, I'd fight you. But that was an excuse. And I think that, you know, they validated that. A lot of them getting, you know, fights because they weren't the biggest attractions. But that was, I think, as much to do with you know, race. We don't, the only color line in my country in boxing is green. That's the only thing we draw the line.
That's right. The Benjamins. Yes. Don, it's
we love everybody.
Pleasure, as per usual. An absolute pleasure, my friend. And we'll speak forever and a day. But let's see what we've got next week.
Thank you, John. God bless.